Scandinavian DNA test results can be shocking. You think you know your ancestry, English, Irish, maybe a little German, but then, out of nowhere, you see it. Scandinavian DNA. No known Viking ancestors, no family stories about Sweden, Norway, or Denmark. Yet, the test says otherwise. How is this possible? Could DNA test be wrong? Or is history hiding something in your blood? The truth is, Scandinavian DNA is far more widespread than most people realize. Millions of people worldwide have genetic traces of the North, often without any direct Scandinavian ancestors in their family tree. Some see just a small percentage, while others, like 20% or even 30%, suggest something much deeper. But this isn't a mistake. It's a clue to a hidden past. To understand why, we have to go back, way back, before the Vikings, before medieval kingdoms, before written history itself. Because the story of Scandinavian DNA begins at the very end of the Ice Age. Over 10,000 years ago, the land we now call Scandinavia was a frozen wilderness, uninhabited, untouched. Then, as the ice melted, the first humans arrived, hunter-gatherers who followed the retreating glaciers. These early people lived in small groups, surviving on fish, game, and forage plants. They weren't farmers, nor were they warriors. They were simply survivors of a harsh and changing world. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherers were the only people in Scandinavia. But then, around 6,000 years ago, a new wave of people arrived. Farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, migrated into Europe, slowly making their way north. They brought agriculture, settled villages, and a completely different way of life. And when they reached Scandinavia, they didn't just bring new technology. They brought new genes. The hunter-gatherers of the north were nearly wiped out, replaced by these early farmers. Then it happened again. Another massive migration. This time, it came from the steppes of Eastern Europe. The Yamnaya people, nomadic herders from the region we now call Ukraine and Russia, surged into Europe. They mixed with the farmers, creating a new culture, one that would spread across the continent. These were the ancestors of the corded were people, who migrated into Scandinavia 5,000 years ago. And these were the people who gave modern Scandinavians most of their DNA. This means that, genetically speaking, today's Scandinavians are not actually direct descendants of the original hunter-gatherers or the first farmers. Instead, they are mostly descended from these steppe herders, people who had never even seen Scandinavia before they arrived. So, what does this have to do with your DNA? The genes of those early Scandinavians didn't stay in the north. Over the centuries, Scandinavians moved, migrated, and mixed. The Viking Age was just one chapter of the story. Before the Vikings, there were the Germanic tribes who migrated south, influencing the genetics of England, Germany, and France. And even after the Viking Age, Scandinavians continued to settle in new lands. This is why millions of people around the world have Scandinavian DNA today. You don't need a recent Viking ancestor. Your connection to Scandinavia could be thousands of years old, buried deep in history. And this is just the beginning. The next part of the story, how the Vikings themselves shaped the genetics of Europe, and why their legacy still lives on in your DNA. Scandinavia is often seen as a land mystery, home to Vikings, fjords, and endless winters. But what if your DNA test reveals that you have Scandinavian ancestry? What does that really mean? To answer that, we have to go beyond geography and understand what Scandinavian DNA actually is. Genetically speaking, Scandinavia isn't just a place. It's a mix of ancient migrations, population shifts, and historical conquests. When you see Scandinavian in your DNA results, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish grandparent. Instead, it means that somewhere in your ancestral past, your genes were shaped by the same forces that created the people of Scandinavia today. Modern DNA testing companies, like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, use genetic markers to determine ethnicity. But these markers don't follow political borders. They follow human movement. That's why a person with deep English roots might find Scandinavian DNA in their results, while someone from Germany or the Netherlands could have it too. Scandinavian genetics have spread far beyond the fjords and forests of the north. One of the biggest reasons for this is the Viking Age. From the 8th to the 11th century, Scandinavian warriors, traders, and settlers spread across Europe and beyond. They didn't just raid, they established entire settlements in places like Scotland, Ireland, England, and even parts of France. Over time, they intermarried with local populations, leaving behind not just their culture, but also their DNA. But Viking blood isn't the only explanation for Scandinavian ancestry. Long before the Viking Age, Germanic tribes migrated from southern Scandinavia into mainland Europe. These tribes, like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, helped shape the modern populations of England and northern Germany. If your ancestors were English, Dutch, or even Polish, there's a chance that your Scandinavian DNA traces back to these ancient migrations rather than Viking warriors. And then there's another layer, the Normans. In 1066, the Normans invaded England and changed the course of history. But who were the Normans? They were originally Vikings who settled in France, adapted to the local culture, and later conquered England. That means if you have English ancestry, some of your Scandinavian DNA might actually come from Vikings, who became French before becoming English. Even after the medieval era, Scandinavians continued to migrate. Many left their homeland during times of war, famine, or economic hardship, settling in places like the United States, Canada, and Australia. If you have Scandinavian DNA but no known Nordic ancestors, it could be from a more recent immigration that was forgotten over generations. So what does Scandinavian DNA really indicate? It means your ancestors, at some point in history, were shaped by the same forces that created the people of Scandinavia today. It doesn't always mean Viking blood, and it doesn't always mean recent ancestry, but it does mean you're connected to one of the most fascinating regions in human history, a place where warriors, traders, and explorers left their mark on the world and on your DNA. And there's even more to uncover. How did the Vikings spread their DNA so far and wide? What genetic clues link modern populations to these ancient explorers? That's what we'll explore next. Long before the Viking Age, long before written history, Scandinavia was a frozen land, untouched by humans. But as the last ice age ended, a new chapter in history began. The arrival of the first Scandinavians. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And how did their genes shape the DNA of millions today? The first humans to set foot in Scandinavia arrived around 10,000 years ago, following the retreating glaciers. These early settlers were hunter-gatherers, living in small, isolated groups. They relied on fishing, hunting, and foraging to survive in the harsh northern climate. These people weren't farmers or warriors. They were survivors, adapting to one of the most challenging environments on Earth. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherers remained the dominant population in Scandinavia. But around 6,000 years ago, everything changed. A new group of people arrived, farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They brought agriculture, settled villages, and a completely different way of life. And when they reached Scandinavia, they didn't just bring new skills, they brought new DNA. These early farmers mixed with the hunter-gatherers, slowly transforming the genetic makeup of Scandinavia. Then, 5,000 years ago, yet another migration reshaped the region. This time, it wasn't farmers, but nomadic herders from the Eurasian steppe. The Yamnaya people, one of the most influential groups in ancient history, moved into Europe, spreading their language, culture, and, most importantly, their genes. The Yamnaya mixed with local farming populations, creating a new culture known as the corded ware complex. When these people arrived in Scandinavia, they didn't just settle, they became the ancestors of the modern Scandinavian population. This means that the original hunter-gatherers, the first people to set foot in Scandinavia, are almost entirely gone from the genetic record. The DNA of modern Scandinavians comes mostly from these later migrations, the farmers from Anatolia and the herders from the Eurasian steppe. But the story doesn't end there. The genetic legacy of these early Scandinavians didn't stay in the north. As people migrated out of Scandinavia over the centuries, they carried their DNA with them. The Germanic tribes that moved into mainland Europe, the Vikings who settled in Britain, Ireland, and beyond, all carried the genes of these ancient migrations. This is why Scandinavian DNA appears in so many people around the world today. Even if you don't have a recent ancestor from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, your DNA might still carry traces of these ancient migrations. The people who first shaped Scandinavia also helped shape the genetic history of Europe and beyond. The Vikings were more than just warriors and raiders. They were explorers, traders, and settlers. But beyond their legends and battles, they left behind something even more lasting: their DNA. Today, millions of people across the world carry genetic traces of the Vikings, even in places where Viking ancestry was never expected. How did they spread their DNA so far? And how much of their legacy still lives on in us? The Viking Age began in 793 AD, with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne, a monastery off the coast of England. But this wasn't just an isolated attack. It was the start of a massive expansion. Over the next 300 years, Vikings from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark spread out in all directions. They sailed to the British Isles, conquered parts of France, ventured deep into Russia, and even reached North America centuries before Columbus. But they didn't just raid, they settled. In England, Viking warriors established the Danelaw, a region under Scandinavian control. In Ireland, they founded cities like Dublin. In France, they became the Normans, a group that would later invade England in 1066. Even in Italy and the Middle East, Vikings fought as mercenaries, leaving behind traces of their genes in unexpected places. One of the biggest ways Viking DNA spread was through intermarriage. Unlike other invaders, Vikings often integrated into the societies they conquered. They married local women, had children, and over generations, their genetic impact spread far beyond their original homelands. But Viking expansion wasn't just about conquering. Sometimes, they took people back with them. Viking raids often involved capturing slaves, who were brought to Scandinavia. These captives, mostly from Britain, Ireland, and Slavic regions, also left their mark on the genetic makeup of modern Scandinavians. This movement of people explains why so many individuals today have unexpected Scandinavian DNA. If you have British ancestry, Viking blood is almost certain to be somewhere in your family tree. Even if it doesn't appear in historical records, your DNA may still carry the legacy of those Norse settlers. But Viking DNA doesn't just show up in Britain and Ireland. Many people in France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and even Italy have traces of Scandinavian ancestry, thanks to Viking expansions. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, millions of descendants of European immigrants still carry this genetic legacy. So, if you've ever wondered why your DNA test showed unexpected Scandinavian ancestry, the answer might be hidden in history. The Vikings may have sailed their longships 1,000 years ago, but their bloodline still flows through millions today. Millions of people worldwide have Scandinavian DNA, yet many have no direct Scandinavian ancestors. How is this possible? What if the Viking connection isn't the only explanation? The truth is, Scandinavian DNA has been spreading across Europe for thousands of years, long before the Viking Age even began. One of the biggest reasons people carry Scandinavian DNA is the Germanic migrations. Before the Vikings, before medieval kingdoms, Scandinavia was home to several early Germanic tribes. These groups, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, didn't stay in Scandinavia forever. Around 1,500 years ago, they began migrating southward, settling in what is now England, Germany, and the Netherlands. This means that if your ancestors were English, Dutch, or even French, you might carry Scandinavian DNA, not because of Vikings, but because of these earlier migrations. But the movement of people didn't stop there. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Vikings were settling in Scotland, Ireland, France, and beyond. However, Viking men weren't just taking land. They were integrating into new societies. They married local women, had children, and over generations, their genetic legacy spread throughout Europe. And then came 1066, one of the most important years in English history. The Normans, led by William the Conqueror, invaded England and changed the country forever. But who were the Normans? Their name literally means Northmen, because their ancestors were Vikings who had settled in France generations earlier. When they took over England, they brought not just their rule, but also their DNA. This is another reason why so many people with English ancestry see Scandinavian DNA in their results. But there's another factor that often surprises people: Scandinavian migration after the Viking Age. Even in more recent history, Scandinavians have continued to settle in new lands. From the 1600s to the 1800s, thousands of Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes moved to places like Scotland, Ireland, and the Netherlands. This means that some Scandinavian DNA in modern populations isn't from ancient warriors at all. It's from peaceful migrants who settled in new regions just a few centuries ago. And then there's the biggest migration of all, the one that took Scandinavian DNA beyond Europe. During the 19th and 20th centuries, millions of Scandinavians left their homeland and moved to North America, Australia, and other parts of the world. Today, millions of people with Scandinavian ancestry live in the United States, Canada, and beyond. So, if you have Scandinavian DNA, but no known Scandinavian ancestors, the answer might be hidden in one of these migrations. Your DNA could be tracing back to Viking settlers, Germanic tribes, Norman conquerors, or even more recent Scandinavian immigrants. The history of Scandinavian DNA isn't just about Vikings, it's about centuries of movement, mixing, and migration. And this raises an even bigger question. How do DNA tests determine Scandinavian ancestry in the first place? And why do results vary from company to company? That's what we'll explore next. Millions of people take DNA tests expecting simple answers about their ancestry. But when the results come back, confusion sets in. One test says you're 15% Scandinavian. Another says 25%. And yet, when you check your family tree, there's no Scandinavian ancestry at all. How is this possible? Are these tests inaccurate? Or is there something deeper going on? To understand why DNA results vary, we need to look at how these tests actually work. Companies like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage don't examine ancient historical records or trace family trees. Instead, they analyze small pieces of your DNA and compare them to modern-day reference populations, groups of people whose ancestors have lived in the same region for centuries. But here's the problem. DNA doesn't follow political borders. It follows human movement. Take the British Isles, for example. A person with deep English roots might show Scandinavian ancestry because of Viking influence in the past. But another person with German or Dutch ancestry might also show Scandinavian DNA because those regions have historical ties to Scandinavia too. It all depends on how a DNA company defines Scandinavian in its reference panels. And that's where things get even trickier. Different companies use different reference groups. Ancestry DNA might categorize certain genetic markers as England and Northwestern Europe, while MyHeritage might classify the same markers as Scandinavian. This is why people often get wildly different results from different companies. But there's another reason DNA results don't always match expectations. Inheritance is random. Each person gets half of their DNA from their mother and half from their father. But that doesn't mean they inherit exactly 50% of every ethnic background their parents have. If your great-great-grandfather was Norwegian, you might inherit a lot of his Scandinavian DNA, or almost none at all. Even full siblings can get different ancestry estimates because they inherit different pieces of DNA. And then there's the issue of genetic noise. Ethnicity estimates aren't precise. They're based on probabilities. Some smaller percentages, like 2% Scandinavian or 3% Southern European, might not mean actual ancestry at all. They could be the result of statistical errors or overlapping genetic markers between populations. So, does this mean ethnicity estimates are useless? Not at all. Over the past decade, DNA tests have become much more accurate, thanks to better algorithms and more diverse reference populations. But they still aren't perfect. That's why many companies update their results over time. If you took a test a few years ago, your results today might be different as new data improves accuracy. So, if you've ever wondered why your DNA results seem confusing, the answer lies in how these tests work, how DNA is inherited, and how history shaped the movement of people across Europe. But one thing is clear: Scandinavian DNA is everywhere, and its presence in your results is never random. But now, let's separate fact from fiction. What are the biggest myths about Scandinavian ancestry? And how can you tell what's real and what's just genetic storytelling? That's what we'll explore next. Scandinavian DNA is a mystery to many, and with it comes a wave of myths and misconceptions. Some believe that having even a small percentage of Scandinavian ancestry means they're directly descended from Vikings. Others think DNA tests are 100% accurate in determining ethnicity. But what's the truth? What does Scandinavian DNA really tell us? And what are the biggest myths that need to be debunked? One of the most common myths is the belief that having Scandinavian DNA means you have a recent Scandinavian ancestor. The truth is, your Scandinavian DNA could be much older than you think. Thanks to Viking expansion, Germanic migrations, and medieval conquests, Scandinavian genes spread far beyond Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Even if none of your ancestors in the past few hundred years were from Scandinavia, your DNA might still carry traces of much older Nordic connections. Another major misconception is that DNA results are always precise. Many people assume that if their test shows 22% Scandinavian, it means exactly 22% of their ancestry comes from that region. But ethnicity estimates are based on probabilities, not exact calculations. Your real genetic connection to Scandinavia could be higher or lower than what's shown. That's why different DNA companies can give different results, because they use different reference populations and algorithms to analyze genetic markers. Then there's the idea that Scandinavian DNA automatically means Viking blood. While it's true that Vikings spread their genes across Europe, not all Scandinavian DNA comes from Viking warriors. Long before the Viking Age, early Germanic tribes migrated from Scandinavia to other parts of Europe. Even after the Viking Age, Scandinavian merchants, farmers, and settlers moved to new lands. So, while Viking ancestry is possible, your Scandinavian DNA could come from a completely different historical migration. A surprising myth is that siblings should have identical ancestry results. Many people assume that if their DNA test shows 20% Scandinavian, their brother or sister should have the same. But because DNA inheritance is random, even full siblings can have different ethnicity results. One sibling might inherit more Scandinavian DNA, while another inherits less, or even none at all. Another misconception is that small percentages of Scandinavian DNA mean you have direct ancestors from that region. If your test shows 2% or 3% Scandinavian, it's possible this is just genetic noise, an overlap in DNA markers between regions rather than true ancestry. However, if your results show 20% or more Scandinavian DNA, that usually indicates a stronger, more recent connection. So, what does Scandinavian DNA really mean? It means that somewhere in your ancestral past, whether through Vikings, Normans, or Germanic migrations, your lineage was influenced by the people of the North. But it doesn't always mean a direct ancestor, and it doesn't always mean Viking heritage. Understanding DNA isn't just about numbers, it's about history, migration, and the randomness of inheritance. Scandinavian DNA has fascinated scientists for decades, but recent breakthroughs have changed everything we thought we knew. For years, the assumption was simple. Modern Scandinavians descended from the first Stone Age hunter-gatherers of the region. But new research has completely overturned that idea. Today, we know that Scandinavia has experienced not just one, but two near-total population replacements in the last 10,000 years. The first major change happened about 6,000 years ago. At that time, Scandinavia was home to hunter-gatherers who had lived there since the Ice Age. But then, a new group arrived, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They brought agriculture, a settled way of life, and most importantly, a completely different genetic profile. Within a few centuries, these farmers replaced most of the original hunter-gatherers, reshaping the genetic landscape of Scandinavia. Then, about 5,000 years ago, another transformation took place. A new wave of people, known as the Amnea, migrated from the Eurasian steppe, modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. These nomadic herders didn't just bring new technology like the wheel and domesticated horses. They brought a genetic shift that would define the Scandinavian gene pool for thousands of years. They mixed with local farming populations, giving rise to the corded ware culture. When these people entered Scandinavia, they almost completely replaced the earlier farming population. Today, studies show that modern Scandinavians are genetically more similar to the Amnea herders than to the original Stone Age inhabitants of the region. In fact, if you have Scandinavian ancestry, Your DNA likely has stronger connections to the Eurasian steppe than to the first people who lived in Scandinavia. But that's not the only discovery shaking up genetic research. Scientists have also found that Scandinavian DNA is not as isolated as once thought. Thanks to Viking expansion, medieval trade routes, and even ancient migrations, Scandinavians have been mixing with other populations for thousands of years. This is why people with British, German, or Dutch ancestry often find Scandinavian DNA in their results, even if they have no direct Scandinavian ancestors. With advances in ancient DNA extraction, researchers are now able to map genetic shifts more accurately than ever before. They can identify specific genes that spread during Viking expansion and even trace how medieval diseases shaped human evolution. As technology improves, future DNA tests may pinpoint Viking ancestors with far greater accuracy. So, what does this mean for the future? As science continues to evolve, the way we understand ancestry will become even more precise. One day, genetic testing might not just tell you that you have Scandinavian DNA. It might tell you exactly where in Scandinavia your ancestors lived and when they migrated. The past is no longer a mystery. It's being rewritten by science, one genome at a time. Your DNA results are more than just percentages on a screen. They are key to unlocking your past. If you've discovered Scandinavian ancestry in your DNA, the next step is understanding how to trace it, verify it, and connect it to real family history. But how do you go from a DNA test result to actual Scandinavian ancestors? The first step is to compare your DNA matches. Sites like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage don't just give ethnicity estimates. They connect you to real people who share segments of your DNA. If you have close DNA matches from Sweden, Norway, or Denmark, that's a strong sign of a more recent Scandinavian connection. But even distant matches can provide valuable clues. Next, it's time to dig into historical records. Many Scandinavians kept detailed church records, census data, and even Viking-era genealogies. Websites like MyHeritage, FamilySearch, and Archive Digital have massive databases of Scandinavian birth, marriage, and immigration records. If your ancestors migrated from Scandinavia, ship passenger lists and naturalization documents might reveal where they came from. But what if you don't have a direct Scandinavian ancestor? That's where Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing can help. These tests trace your paternal and maternal lines back thousands of years, giving you deeper insight into your ancient origins. If your Y-DNA or mDNA haplogroups are common in Scandinavia, your genetic roots may go back further than historical records can reach. And then, there's the power of triangulation. If multiple DNA matches share a common ancestor, you can start building a genetic family tree. This method helps confirm which parts of your ancestry truly connect to Scandinavia and which might be from other European migrations. But the real magic happens when you combine DNA with historical and cultural research. Understanding the Viking migration routes, medieval Scandinavian settlements, and even recent Scandinavian immigration patterns can give context to your results. Many people with English or German ancestry, for example, might find that their Scandinavian DNA comes not from direct Viking ancestors, but from medieval Norman or Germanic migrations. So, if you've ever wondered how to turn your DNA results into a real journey through history, the answer lies in combining science, records, and storytelling. Your Scandinavian DNA is more than just numbers. It's a legacy that connects you to one of the most adventurous, resilient, and influential cultures in history. And that concludes this deep dive into Scandinavian DNA. From the first settlers of the Ice Age to the Viking expansion, and from genetic mysteries to modern scientific breakthroughs, we've explored how Scandinavian DNA has shaped the world, and how it might just be a part of your own story.